The tray hit the linen-covered table without a sound. That was the first thing anyone noticed afterward when they tried to reconstruct what happened. Not the shout, not the scream from the woman in the emerald dress, not the scrape of chair legs against marble. The tray. Set down. Not dropped, not thrown. Placed. The way a man sets down something he intends to pick back up later. Marcus Webb had been carrying that tray for 6 hours. Champagne flutes, mostly. Some canapés. Nobody was eating, because the kind of people who attended a gala like this didn't eat in public. He'd refilled the same glass for a hedge fund manager 4 times without being asked, because that was the job, and the job was invisible until it wasn't. He saw the first man 11 minutes before anyone else did. Not because he was paranoid, because he was trained to notice the things that didn't belong, and this man's jacket didn't sit right across the shoulder. There was a weight under it that pulled the fabric wrong, a half-inch of sag that a good tailor would never allow, and a rented tuxedo couldn't hide from someone who'd spent a decade learning exactly what a concealed weapon does to the drape of expensive cloth. He clocked the second man near the bar, drinking club soda and pretending it was gin, eyes moving in slow, deliberate sweeps instead of the loose, half-interested glances of an actual guest. The third was harder. The third was good, but even the good ones checked exits. Even the good ones stood a little too close to the woman everyone in the room orbited around. The reason for the gala, the reason for the marble floor and the string quartet, and the $400,000 in catering. Eleanor Vance, founder and CEO of Vance Dynamics, 52 years old, silver hair pulled back, a smile she'd perfected for cameras and never quite let reach her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Marcus watched the 3 men close the distance to her like water finding the low point in a room. Nobody else saw it, because nobody else was looking for it. That was the whole design. If you've ever known you were right about something and had no one who would listen, if you've ever been the only person in the room who could see what was actually happening while everyone around you stayed comfortable in not knowing, stay with this one until the end. Because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when that kind of man finally stops staying quiet. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Webb was on his knees in a kitchen that wasn't his, unclogging a drain for the 4th time that month, because the property management company that ran his apartment building considered plumbing an optional service rather than an obligation. His daughter, Lily, was 7 years old and sitting at the kitchen table doing homework with the particular fierce concentration that 7-year-olds bring to subtraction. Her mother had died 4 years earlier. Cancer. Fast and merciless. The kind that didn't leave much room for the goodbyes people imagined they'd get. Marcus had been 3 years out of the military by then, already adjusting to civilian life, already learning that the skills that made him exceptional in Delta Force translated to almost nothing on a resume that civilian employers could parse. He didn't talk about the years before. Not because they were classified, though some of them were, but because there was no version of the story that fit into small talk. Try explaining to a hiring manager that you spent 4 years doing things you can't describe in rooms you can't name, and watch how fast the conversation ends. So he waited tables. He drove for a rideshare service on the nights Lily was asleep and a neighbor could watch her. He picked up shifts at a warehouse on weekends when the schedule allowed it. 3 jobs. 1 daughter, and an apartment with a bedroom for her and a pull-out couch for him, because that was the math that worked. He never once told Lily that any of this was hard. He told her instead that Tuesdays were pancake days and Fridays were library days, and that when he tucked her in, he would always be there in the morning. He kept that promise the way other men kept oaths sworn on something larger than themselves, because to him it was exactly that. The catering company he worked for, Prestige Event Staffing, had been contracted for the Vance Dynamics annual charity gala for 3 years running. Marcus had worked the previous 2 without incident, moving through those rooms the way he moved through everything, quiet, competent, unnoticed. He was good at unnoticed. Unnoticed had kept him alive in places most people couldn't find on a map. The floor manager that night was a man named Denny Rourke, mid-40s, prematurely gray, permanently irritated. The kind of manager who believed that shouting at waitstaff in a hallway constituted leadership. Denny didn't know anything about Marcus's history. Nobody at Prestige knew. It wasn't in the file, because Marcus had never put it in the file. He filled out the application the same way anyone else did. Previous employment, security consulting. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole truth. Denny liked to remind the staff, loudly, that they were replaceable. "You're not here to be seen," he told a new hire that same week, a college kid named Theo, who dropped a tray of oysters. "You're here to be invisible and efficient. If I wanted personality, I'd have hired a personality." Marcus said nothing when Denny barked orders at him that didn't need to be barked. He set glasses on trays and carried them where they needed to go, and did not argue, because arguing with Denny Rourke was a waste of the only currency Marcus actually valued, which was time he could otherwise spend with his daughter. Night of the gala. He arrived at 4 in the afternoon for setup. The Vance Dynamics building lobby had been transformed, chandeliers dimmed to a warm gold, round tables draped in ivory. A stage set for the evening's remarks about the company's new education initiative, a foundation that promised scholarships to underprivileged students studying engineering and computer science. It was, on paper, a beautiful cause. Eleanor Vance had built Vance Dynamics from a modest robotics startup into a multi-billion-dollar aerospace and defense contractor over the course of 26 years, and the foundation was, according to every press release, her way of giving back. Marcus had read about her before, in the way anyone reads about a stranger, whose name shows up often enough to become background noise. He knew she'd taken over the company from her father. He knew Vance Dynamics had contracts with the government, contracts that touched, tangentially, some of the same worlds Marcus used to operate in, though he never said that to anyone, least of all himself, because thinking about that world too long was a door he preferred to keep shut. He did not expect to speak to her that night. Waiters didn't speak to CEOs. That was the order of things, the invisible architecture of a room like this, servers moving along one plane and the wealthy moving along another, the two never quite intersecting, except in the narrow moment when a tray was extended and a hand reached out to take a glass from it. That was, in fact, exactly what happened at 7:42 that evening, when Eleanor Vance reached for a glass of champagne from Marcus's tray and for half a second made actual eye contact with him. "Thank you," she said, the way people say thank you to furniture that happens to be helpful, polite, automatic. Already turning away before the second word left her mouth, Marcus nodded and moved on. That was the entire interaction. Neither of them thought anything more of it. The first sign that the evening would not go according to anyone's plan came at 8:15, when the man with the ill-fitting jacket drifted away from the bar and began moving, unhurried, toward the small cluster of security details stationed near the stage. Marcus watched him go. He watched the second man peel off from a conversation with a state senator's aide and begin moving in a parallel line from the opposite side of the room. He watched the third man, the good one, straighten his cuffs in a gesture that had nothing to do with his cuffs and everything to do with checking the positioning of something concealed beneath his jacket at the small of his back. Textbook. A pincer formation, executed by people who'd clearly rehearsed this, closing on a target from 3 directions while the room's actual security, 4 men in dark suits who looked competent enough on a resume, stood in loose formation near the stage entrance, distracted by earpieces and radio chatter that Marcus suspected, correctly as it turned out later, was being jammed or spoofed by someone outside. He did the math the way he'd been trained to do it. Fast, wordless, automatic. Distance to the nearest threat. Distance to Eleanor Vance. Distance to the nearest exit. Number of civilians in the blast radius of a bad decision. Time. He had, by his own later estimate, about 4 seconds before the first man reached striking distance of the CEO. He set the tray down. He did not run. Running drew eyes, and eyes drawn to him were eyes not drawn to the threat, and for one more half second, he needed the room to stay exactly as unaware as it had been for the entire evening. He walked, fast, efficient, unremarkable, the walk of a waiter, heading toward a spill that needed cleaning, right up until the moment the first man's hand closed around Eleanor Vance's upper arm and pulled her backward, and the jacket fell open, and the room finally, belatedly, understood what was happening. Someone screamed. The 4 bodyguards, to their credit, reacted. But reacting and acting are different disciplines, and the half-second of confusion, The half-second of hands going toward holsters that weren't built for a crowd this dense. The half-second of nobody wanting to fire a weapon into a room full of billionaires and senators and their spouses was exactly the half-second the three men had planned for. It was exactly the half-second that turned 4 trained bodyguards into 4 frozen men. Marcus did not have that half-second of hesitation because he had spent a decade of his life training the hesitation out of himself in rooms far worse than this one. He reached the first man from behind, the one holding Eleanor Vance's arm, and did not go for the weapon first. Weapons could wait half a second. He went for the joint, a short, brutal manipulation of the man's elbow that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with leverage. The mechanics of a hinge being pushed in a direction a hinge was never built to move. The man's grip on Eleanor's arm released involuntarily. A nervous system response no amount of training could override, and Marcus redirected the weapon hand downward and stripped the pistol free in the same motion, the gun clattering somewhere beneath a table. That was 1 second. The second man, seeing his partner go down, turned and raised his own weapon, and Marcus was already moving, already inside the arc of the barrel before it could level. Closing distance, because distance was the only advantage a gun had over a hand, and closing it removed that advantage entirely. He drove the heel of his palm into the man's jaw. Not hard enough to kill, precisely calibrated to disorient, and used the same forward momentum to sweep the man's legs out from under him, the weapon skittering across marble as the man went down hard onto his back. That was 3 seconds. The third man, the good one, had the sense to hesitate, which in this particular equation was the worst decision available to him, because hesitation gave Marcus the half-second he needed to close the final distance. The man raised his weapon, and Marcus's hand was already there, wrist against wrist, torquing the weapon sideways and down and out of a grip that had gone, in an instant, from confident to desperate. The disarm ended with a man face down on the marble, his own arm bent up behind his back at an angle that promised significant pain with any further resistance, and Marcus's knee planted between his shoulder blades with exactly enough weight to make the point without breaking anything. 8 seconds, beginning to end. The rune did not process it as fast as it happened. There's a lag in human perception when something moves faster than the brain expects violence to move. And, for a moment after the third man hit the floor, the room was simply silent. 400 people staring at a waiter kneeling on the back of an armed intruder in the middle of a marble ballroom, 2 other men groaning on the floor beside him. 3 weapons scattered across the floor like something dropped from a magician's sleeve. Then the room exploded into noise. Screaming, shouting, the scrape of chairs, the actual security detail finally arriving. Guns drawn now that the threat had already been neutralized by someone else. Radios crackling. Someone calling for police. Someone calling for an ambulance. Someone calling for a lawyer. Because that was the reflex of at least one person in that room, even during an attempted kidnapping. Marcus rose to his feet the moment the actual security detail took control of the third man, stepping back with his hands slightly raised, palms open, the universal signal of a man who had done what needed doing and had no further interest in the credit. Eleanor Vance stood a few feet away, her hair slightly disheveled, one strap of her dress pulled askew, staring at him with an expression that had nothing performative left in it at all. "Who?" she said, and stopped, because the question was too large to finish in a single sentence. Marcus bent down, picked his serving tray back up off the table where he'd set it 8 seconds in a lifetime ago, and said the only thing that felt true. "I should get back to the kitchen. Table 9 still needs their entrées." He turned and walked away before she could stop him, moving through a crowd that parted around him the way water parts around a stone, and by the time actual police arrived, 12 minutes later, Marcus Webb had returned to the kitchen, put his tray down properly this time, and gone back to plating salmon, because a job was a job, and Denny Rourke would absolutely dock his pay. For an unexplained absence from his station, Gala interrupted by attempted kidnapping, notwithstanding. The police, when they finally found him, found a man who answered every question with the same flat, unemotional precision he'd used to disarm 3 armed men. Name, employer, address, what he saw, what he did. Nothing more offered than what was asked. It was the detective running background checks that night, a woman named Patricia Alcaraz with 15 years on the force, who found the discrepancy that turned a strange incident into a genuine story. Marcus Webb, 46 seconds after the initial database query, came back with a redacted service record, so heavily blacked out that the file was almost more black ink than white page. What wasn't redacted was enough. Delta Force. Multiple deployments. A silver star, a bronze star with Valor device. Commendations that used language so restrained it somehow made the actual events more unsettling to imagine. Alcaraz sat back in her chair and looked at the file for a long moment. He set his tray down, she said to her partner, mostly to herself. The security footage shows him setting the tray down before he moved. Like he had time to think about it. He had. Eleanor Vance did not sleep that night. She sat in her penthouse replaying the 8 seconds over and over on a laptop screen. Security footage her head of operations had sent her within the hour, unable to look away from the moment a waiter she'd thanked automatically, barely glancing at his face. Dismantled 3 armed men with the economy of motion that professional fighters trained their entire lives to achieve, and rarely did. She was 52 years old. She had inherited Vance dynamics from her father 18 years earlier, at a moment when the company was smaller, leaner, and in her private assessment, more honest. She had spent nearly 2 decades building it into something larger, and somewhere in that process, she had also spent nearly 2 decades growing quietly, persistently uncertain about who around her could actually be trusted. She was surrounded by people whose loyalty she paid for. That was different. She understood now, watching this footage at 2 in the morning, from being surrounded by people who would act because acting was correct, not because acting was compensated. Her head of security detail, a man named Roland Voss, who had been with her for 9 years and had, that evening, frozen along with the rest of his team for a critical half-second that could have gotten her killed, called her twice that night. She did not answer either time. She watched the 8 seconds one more time, before she finally set the laptop aside and tried, unsuccessfully, to sleep. The next morning she asked her assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya who had a talent for finding things quickly, to locate the identity of the waiter from Prestige event staffing who had intervened the previous night. It took Priya 4 hours, partly because Prestige's records were a mess, and partly because Marcus Webb, it turned out, had left no forwarding information beyond an address that, when Priya finally drove there herself, instead of trusting it to a courier, turned out to be a modest apartment complex on the unglamorous side of the city. The kind of building with a broken intercom and a parking lot with more cracks than asphalt. Priya reported back to Eleanor with a level of discomfort in her voice that Eleanor noted immediately. He works 3 jobs, Priya said. Waiter, rideshare driver, and warehouse associate on weekends. Single father, 7-year-old daughter, wife died 4 years ago. Cancer. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. And his military record, mostly redacted. What isn't redacted is extraordinary. Silver Star. 2 tours that I can find references to, though the specifics are gone. He left the service 6 years ago. There's a gap in his employment history right after that. Then he starts showing up in the kind of jobs that don't ask many questions. Why would a man like that be waiting tables? It wasn't really a question, and Priya didn't try to answer it as one. Eleanor sat with that information the way she sat with quarterly reports that didn't add up, turning it over, looking for the seam where it should have made sense and didn't. A man capable of dismantling 3 armed men in 8 seconds. A man with commendations for valor that the government still wouldn't fully declassify, was living in a 1-bedroom apartment and driving for a rideshare app on nights his neighbor could watch his daughter. Something about that arithmetic offended her in a way she didn't immediately have language for. It would take her several more days and several more conversations to understand that what she was feeling wasn't pity. It was recognition of a debt that the world, broadly, and her company, specifically, had failed to pay. She decided to go herself, not send an assistant, not send a check through Priya, though she'd considered it. A simple, transactional gesture that would have let her feel resolved about the matter without actually looking at it. She told her driver to take her to the address personally on a Saturday afternoon, without an entourage, without a press release, without Roland Voss trailing 3 steps behind her, muttering about security protocols she was fairly sure had failed her. The night before, anyway. Marcus was in the small parking lot behind his building when she arrived, kneeling next to a bicycle with training wheels, tightening a bolt with a hex key, while his daughter stood nearby holding a helmet 2 sizes too large, chattering about a book she'd read at school. Eleanor Vance stood by her car for a moment before approaching, watching the scene with an attentiveness that surprised her. There was nothing remarkable about it. A father fixing a bicycle, but there was something in the precision of his hands, the same economical, unhurried competence she'd watched on that security footage a dozen times now, applied here to a bolt instead of an armed man's wrist. "Mr. Webb," she said. He looked up, recognized her instantly, and did not seem surprised, which surprised her more than anything else that day. "Miss Vance." He set the hex key down on the pavement beside the bike, the same unhurried economy of motion, and rose to his feet. "This is my daughter, Lily." Lily, 7 years old, and entirely unimpressed by the presence of a woman worth several $billion, held up the oversized helmet. "Daddy says I have to wear this, even though it's too big, because safety is safety," she informed Eleanor with the gravity only a 7-year-old can bring to a statement like that. "Your daddy's right," Eleanor said, and found to her own mild surprise that she meant it more broadly than the helmet. Marcus did not ask why she'd come. He waited, the same way he'd waited 8 seconds the night before, patient, alert, unwilling to move, before the situation clarified itself. "I wanted to thank you," Eleanor said. Properly. Not through a card or a donation, though there will be one of those too. "I wanted to see who you were. I did what needed doing," Marcus said. "That's all. 3 men, armed, trained, according to the police, likely former military themselves, possibly foreign contractors. You disarmed all of them in 8 seconds and walked away before anyone could thank you." Eleanor studied his face, looking for something. Vanity, expectation, the faint hunger for recognition she'd seen in 1,000 executives across 1,000 conference tables. She found none of it. Most people would have wanted credit. "Credit doesn't pay rent," Marcus said, simply, without bitterness, a statement of fact rather than a complaint. "And it wouldn't have changed what I did." Eleanor looked around at the parking lot with its cracked asphalt, at the modest building behind him, at the small bicycle with its training wheels, at the daughter watching this exchange between adults with the patient boredom of a child waiting for something more interesting to happen. "You saved my life," Eleanor said. "I would like to offer you a position. Head of my personal security detail. Effective immediately, with a salary that reflects what you're actually worth, which is considerably more than what I'm currently paying the 4 men who failed to do what you did in 8 seconds. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said, "but I need to think about it. I have a daughter to raise, and the hours a job like that requires aren't hours I'm willing to give up." It was, Eleanor would later reflect, the first time in almost a decade that anyone had turned down an offer from her without immediately trying to negotiate for more. The refusal wasn't posturing. It was a boundary, stated plainly, the same way he'd stated everything else since she'd arrived. "Take the time you need," she said, surprising herself again with how easily the patience came. "But I'd like to understand something first, if you're willing to tell me. Why were you waiting tables at all? Why the rideshare driving the warehouse shifts? A man with your record could have found work in private security consulting, any number of fields that would have paid enough that you wouldn't need 3 jobs. Marcus glanced at Lily, who had wandered a few steps away to examine an anthill with the total absorption only children can bring to insects. "Most of those jobs require travel," he said. "Deployments, contracts overseas, weeks away from home at a time. I made a decision when my wife died that Lily wasn't going to lose both parents to a job. Waiting tables isn't glamorous, but I'm home every night. I make her breakfast every morning. That's worth more to me than a title." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, subtle, structural, like a door that had been locked for a long time, discovering it was, in fact, slightly ajar. "That's the most sensible thing anyone said to me in about 2 years," she said. She left without pushing further that day, though she returned 3 days later, and then again the following week, and the conversations that followed those visits began to reveal something Eleanor hadn't expected to find when she'd first driven out to that cracked parking lot, looking to discharge a debt of gratitude. Marcus Webb, it turned out, had spent his post-military years doing more than surviving. He had almost, as a private discipline, kept himself sharp. He read technical manuals for fun, actual fun, the way other men read novels. He taught himself over the past several years the fundamentals of corporate and residential security systems, not because anyone paid him to, but because understanding systems, all systems, mechanical, procedural, human, was simply how his mind worked. He noticed vulnerabilities the way other people noticed weather. It was during their fourth conversation, over coffee in his small but immaculately organized kitchen, while Lily did homework at the table, that Marcus mentioned, almost as an aside, something that had been bothering him since the night of the gala. "Your security detail wasn't just unlucky that night," he said. "They were compromised before the event even started." Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "What do you mean, compromised?" "The radio communications were being jammed or spoofed. I couldn't tell which from where I was standing. But the delay in their response wasn't nerves. It was a system failure. 4 men who freeze simultaneously for the same half-second aren't reacting to fear. They're reacting to a coordinated disruption in their equipment or their information." Marcus turned his cup slowly on the table, the same unhurried precision in the gesture that showed up in everything he did. "Someone planned that. Someone who knew your security protocols well enough to defeat them. Specifically, not generally. That's not something 3 hired guns figure out on their own. That takes inside knowledge." Eleanor sat very still. "You're saying someone inside my company was involved. I'm saying it's worth finding out," Marcus said. "I'm not accusing anyone. I don't have proof. I have an observation, and 12 years of training, that tells me observations like this are usually right. Dim." "It was," Eleanor would later say, "the moment the entire shape of her company changed in her mind, though the actual unraveling took another 3 weeks to complete." Eleanor brought in an independent security consultant, a woman with a background in federal counterintelligence work, to review the communications logs from the night of the gala. The consultant confirmed within days what Marcus had suspected within seconds. The security detail's radio frequencies had been actively jammed for a window of exactly 90 seconds, beginning 4 minutes before the 3 men made their move and ending roughly a minute after Marcus had already neutralized them. The jamming equipment used was sophisticated, expensive, and precisely calibrated to the specific frequencies Vance Dynamics Security used, information that was not publicly available and had only been updated 8 months earlier. 8 months earlier was also, the consultant discovered after cross-referencing employment records, when Vance Dynamics had hired a new executive vice president of corporate operations, a man named Griffin Halstead, who had personally overseen the security protocol update as part of a broader cost-cutting initiative he'd championed since joining the company. Griffin Halstead was 44 years old, Harvard-educated, smooth in a way that photographed well and interviewed even better. He had joined Vance Dynamics after a string of executive roles at other firms, each one shorter than the last, though his resume presented the pattern as a story of ambitious upward mobility rather than what it more likely was, a man staying just ahead of scrutiny. He had, over 8 months, made himself indispensable to Eleanor in the particular way ambitious men make themselves indispensable, always available, always ready with a confident answer, always positioned exactly where credit could be claimed and blame could be deflected. Eleanor had trusted him more than she trusted almost anyone else in her executive suite, in part because her father had always told her that confidence was a reasonable proxy for competence, and Griffin Halstead had confidence in the kind of abundance that made people forget to check the substance underneath it. The independent consultant's report, delivered to Eleanor 11 days after the gala, laid out a case that was circumstantial but damning. Halstead's cost-cutting initiative had quietly replaced Vance Dynamics' encrypted security communications system with a cheaper, less secure alternative, a decision he'd presented to the board as a routine efficiency measure that would save the company nearly $2 million annually. The new system's vulnerabilities were exactly the vulnerabilities exploited during the gala. Financial records, when a consultant dug deeper with a forensic accountant's help, revealed a series of payments from a shell company with only the thinnest of connections to a private security contractor with a documented history of doing exactly the kind of coordinated jamming operation used that night. The shell company had made one more payment, 3 days after the gala, to an account that traced through 4 other shell layers, back to Griffin Halstead himself. Eleanor read the report twice. Then she read it a third time, sitting alone in her office at 9 at night, the building empty around her, trying to reconcile the man who'd sat across from her in board meetings for 8 months with the man the forensic accountant's paper trail described. A man who had, apparently, orchestrated the compromise of her own security detail, potentially to facilitate a kidnapping, likely for ransom, though the exact endgame remained unclear even after the investigation concluded. What was clear was motive. Once the forensic accountant kept digging, Halstead's cost-cutting initiatives across multiple companies over the years had a pattern to them once someone bothered to look. He cut real safety and security investments while representing them as unnecessary overhead, then diverted the difference through shell arrangements into his own accounts, a pattern that had, at his previous 2 companies, ended in his quiet resignation right before anyone connected the dots. Vance Dynamics was simply the company where someone finally had. Eleanor called Marcus that night. "I need you to look at something," she said. "And I need you to tell me honestly what you think, because I trust your judgment more than I trust anyone currently on my payroll." He came in the next morning, sat across from her with the forensic report between them, and read through it with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, occasionally asking a precise, pointed question that cut directly to the weakest part of the analysis, testing it the way he might test whether a knot would hold. "It's solid," he said finally. "The financial trail is clean enough for a courtroom, but you'll need to move carefully. A man who's done this before, at other companies, knows how to disappear before the accusation lands publicly." "What would you do?" "I'd call a board meeting," Marcus said. "Not a private conversation. Not a quiet resignation with a severance package that lets him walk away and do this somewhere else. A board meeting, with the evidence laid out where everyone can see it, so there's no version of this story where he gets to control the narrative afterward." Eleanor called the board meeting for the following Thursday. Griffin Halstead arrived at that meeting exactly as confident as he'd arrived at every meeting for the past 8 months, in a suit that fit exactly the way suits fit men who'd never had to worry about whether they'd afford the next payment on it. Carrying a leather portfolio and a presentation about the 4th quarter cost savings his initiatives had generated. "As you'll see on slide 4, he told the assembled board members, 12 people around a long table, Eleanor at its head. "Our security modernization alone has saved the company $1.8 million this fiscal year, with projected savings of over $7 million across the next 3 years as we continue to streamline redundant systems." He clicked to the next slide, smooth, rehearsed, the confident cadence of a man who had given this exact kind of presentation 100 times before and never once had it interrupted by consequences. "I'd like to pause you there, Griffin," Eleanor said. He stopped. Smiled the easy smile of a man who assumed the interruption was a question he'd enjoy answering. "Of course. What would you like to know?" "I'd like to know," Eleanor said, "why the security modernization you're so proud of happened to disable exactly the frequencies that would have allowed my security detail to respond in time to prevent an armed kidnapping attempt at my own gala 3 weeks ago." The room went very quiet. Griffin's smile did not disappear immediately. That was, Eleanor noted later, the strange part, how long a practiced expression could hold even after the substance behind it had already collapsed. "I'm not sure I understand the question," he said. "The incident at the gala was a tragic security failure, certainly, but attributing it to a cost-saving initiative that was thoroughly vetted by our operations team seems, respectfully, like a significant leap." "It's not a leap," Eleanor said. "It's a paper trail." She nodded toward the door, where Marcus Webb stepped in, along with the independent security consultant and the forensic accountant, each carrying a folder. The consultant walked the board through the technical findings first, the specific frequencies compromised, the timing of the jamming relative to the attack, the documented vulnerabilities introduced by the security system Halstead had personally selected and championed against the recommendations of 2 internal engineers who had raised concerns in emails that had, curiously, never been forwarded to the board. Then the forensic accountant walked through the financial trail, the shell company, the 4 layers of obscuring transactions, the payment 3 days after the gala that traced back, however indirectly, to an account under Griffin Halstead's control. Griffin's face, throughout this presentation, moved through several distinct phases. Confidence first, the assumption that this was survivable. That confident denial would carry him through, as it apparently had at his previous 2 companies. Then, a flicker of genuine alarm as the financial trail proved more specific than he'd evidently anticipated anyone finding. Then, finally, something that looked almost like resignation, though resignation delivered with one last attempt at smooth deflection. "This is circumstantial," he said. "None of this proves I had any direct knowledge of a plot to harm anyone. I made a business decision about a vendor. If that vendor turned out to have criminal associations, that's a due diligence failure, certainly, but it's not evidence of intent. The payment to your account was made using the same shell structure as the payment to the security contractor who conducted the jamming operation," the forensic accountant said quietly, without theatrics, the way a person states a fact that doesn't need embellishment because the fact itself is damning enough. "The structure isn't a coincidence, it's a fingerprint." Marcus had said very little throughout the meeting, standing near the door, arms loosely at his sides, the same quiet stillness he'd carried into the ballroom 3 weeks earlier. But when Griffin's eyes finally landed on him, some old executive instinct, reaching for a target to redirect blame toward, Marcus spoke, and the room's attention swung to him immediately. "I watched 3 men move toward Miss Vance for 11 minutes before anyone else noticed," he said. "I watched her security detail freeze for exactly the window your system failure created. 8 seconds after that, all 3 men were disarmed. None of that happened because of luck, and none of what happened before it happened by accident either. Somebody made a choice to make her less safe so that somebody else could profit from it. I don't know if you intended for anyone to get hurt that night, Mr. Halstead, but I know you built the door they walked through." The board voted to suspend Griffin Halstead pending a full criminal referral before the meeting concluded. Security escorted him from the building within the hour, his leather portfolio left behind on the conference table, his presentation slides still glowing faintly on the screen at the front of the room, a monument to savings that had cost far more than anyone initially understood. The criminal investigation that followed took months to fully unwind, uncovering a pattern of similar schemes at his 2 previous companies that had gone unpunished, largely because no one had ever assembled the evidence with the kind of patient, methodical clarity that Marcus Webb brought to everything he touched. Eleanor offered Marcus the position again, 2 weeks after the board meeting, this time not as head of a security detail that reported up through layers of corporate hierarchy, but as an independent security advisor reporting directly to her and the board, with the explicit authority to audit any department, any vendor, any protocol across the entire company, answerable to no one but the board itself. "I want you to be the check," she told him, sitting in his kitchen again, Lily's homework spread across the table between them. "Not an employee who can be managed around, someone with the authority to say no and have it actually mean something." Marcus considered it the way he considered everything, without hurry, weighing it against the only metric that had ever mattered to him. "I need control over my schedule," he said. "I'm not missing breakfast with my daughter. I'm not taking calls after 6 unless something is genuinely urgent. If that works for you, it works for me." "It works," Eleanor said, and meant it. He took the position on those terms, and within 6 months, Vance Dynamics had rebuilt its security infrastructure from the ground up, this time under Marcus's direct oversight, with cost-saving initiatives that were actually vetted for what they claimed to save rather than what they concealed. He brought in engineers he trusted, people who valued substance over the appearance of competence, and slowly, the culture around him shifted, the way water eventually finds its way around every obstacle in a riverbed, reshaping the landscape simply by persisting. Eleanor found herself, in the months that followed, seeking his counsel on matters that had nothing to do with security. She valued the particular clarity of a man who said exactly what he meant and no more, who never postured, who never tried to make himself larger in a conversation than the truth required. It was different from every other relationship she'd built inside her own company, most of which had been built on a foundation of people telling her what they thought she wanted to hear. They began having dinner occasionally, not as executive and advisor, but as two people who had discovered, almost by accident, that they enjoyed each other's company in the quiet, unhurried way that mattered more than either of them initially expected it to. Lily, for her part, decided within the first month that Eleanor was, in her words, pretty okay for a rich lady, which Marcus took, correctly, as high praise from his daughter. On a Tuesday evening, nearly a year after the gala, Eleanor sat in Marcus's kitchen while Lily worked through a stack of pancakes with the same ferocious concentration she once reserved for subtraction, and Marcus stood at the stove, unhurried, competent, entirely present in the small, ordinary moment, the way he was present in every moment, whether it involved disarming armed men or flipping pancakes for his daughter. Tuesdays are pancake days, Lily informed Eleanor, as though this were a fact of the universe rather than a rule her father had made. I've heard, Eleanor said, and found, watching Marcus at the stove in his modest kitchen, that she meant something larger by it too. A company rebuilt from a rot she hadn't known was there. A trust re-established on a foundation of actual competence rather than confident appearances. A man who had walked into a room, done what needed doing, and walked away without asking for anything in return, until the world, slowly and deliberately, insisted on giving him what he'd earned anyway. Marcus set a plate down in front of her, the same way he set everything down, with quiet, deliberate care. She picked up her fork and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply enjoyed the meal in front of her, without calculating what it cost or who might be watching. Outside, the evening settled over the city the way evenings do, ordinary and unremarkable. The kind of evening that never makes the news, which was, Marcus had come to understand, usually the best kind there was.